Today's lecture is on the subject of organic evolution. We just finished the whole topic of continental drift, seafloor spreading plate tectonics, wherein I spoke about the Earth being dynamic and ever-changing. Now we're going to talk about life on Earth, all living things on Earth, also in this game of forever changing, and that is within the subject of organic evolution. First, we need to talk about these things called adaptations. The upper picture you're looking at is a cartoon of the skull of your house cat, regular cat, and the lower picture is a photograph of a jaw of a horse. And teeth in mammals' heads are really good ways to think about adaptations. Adaptations are specialized features that allow animals, plants, life to perform a function that is useful to them. So, for example, cats are the optimal predators for hunting down and catching and killing and eating small rodents, small birds. They have long, sharp canines for piercing flesh of those little bodies, and then behind their canines, they have a series of teeth that are carnassials. They will literally slice meat like scissors. And so it's a way to quickly kill prey, put it back in the processing area, slice it up, and get it down. Horses don't do that. Horses, as you know, eat hay, they eat grass, they eat oats, hard, silica-rich plant material. And so they have teeth in the same positions. So they have incisors, canines, molars, premolars, but especially their molars, they're wide and flat with these sort of arched hemisphere shapes on them, which are ideal for chewing these high silica-rich grasses. Another way to look at adaptations is that this is remodeling, not new construction. So it's not the creation of new things. It's taking a common ground plan and adjusting it. So those cheek teeth in mammals, they are made of a calcium phosphate material. They have 3 layers. They are set in sockets in a particular bone that exists in a particular place in the mammal body. It's the only difference between the skull of the cat and the skull of the horse is reconstruction. Same thing here, something a little bit harder for most people to think about, but we're looking at crabs and the different species of crabs, and depending upon their diet and where they live, there is adaptation to show the crab claws in different ways for their different diets. Now, we need to talk about quickly here the whole issue of Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is the name we most often associate with natural selection and evolution, but Alfred Russel Wallace actually described it, laid it out just before Darwin. Long story, but eventually they become quite good friends, and they have a lot of similarities. And I always try to revive Wallace for people so that people know that Wallace is every bit as important in evolutionary biology as Charles Darwin. What did they both see? What both led them down this path? Well, both of them traveled widely around the world while they were young men, and they were able to observe many adaptations in the tropics. They both came from England, which, if you've been there, is a gray, wet, kind of dreary place. And yes, there's life everywhere, but you don't have the same diversity of life, and so you don't see all of these wonderful adaptations. But by going around the world, especially to the tropics, they saw lots of different examples. Their minds were flooded with examples. And the classic example is Charles Darwin and the finches. And so in his trip around the globe on the ship, the HMS Beagle, Darwin traveled to the Galapagos Islands, which are a small archipelago of these volcanic islands. It's many hundreds of miles from South America, and at the same latitude in South America, he witnessed hundreds of different species of birds doing all kinds of bird things, eating different diets, different ways. But on these Galapagos Islands, there were finches. But not just one finch or a couple of finches, but lots of finches doing different things that on the mainland were done by many other different species. And if you look at these things, you see that there are finches that live in the trees, finches that live in the grounds, finches that eat seeds, finches that eat berries, finches that eat insects, finches that eat cactus, finches that eat carrion. And they still all pretty much have the finch body. What's changed here? What's the adaptation is in the bills. The bills, the action end of the creature is very different depending upon their diet. And so Darwin would see this and note, okay, there's this difference. And he started this whole notion of tree thinking, that there's an evolutionary relationship between them. What else? Both Wallace and Darwin were astute students of artificial selection. Artificial selection, we'd call these people farmers or ranchers or dog breeders, but in artificial selection, a breeder, a person, chooses which male will mate with which female to make the next generation. And so in agriculture, we do this all the time with cows. You know, your highest production cows, those are the ones you allow to make the next generation of offspring. Sheep for wool, plants, you know, you have some corn plants, some hybrids that yield a high amount of corn, or a corn with a high sugar content, and you allow those to reproduce for the next generation. And you can go pretty far with this. And I always trot out this example of Brassica oleracea. Most people don't know what that scientific name means, but you've probably seen these things, and maybe you like them, maybe you hate them, but all of these, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, Brocco flower, Brussels sprouts, and several more, they are all the same species. The only thing that's different here is that the breeders, the farmers, have selected for different things. So if you want big flowers, there's a selection for these things like broccoli and cauliflower. You can also select for leaves, which is more cabbage, kale. Breeding can take you a long way. And without showing you pictures, I want you to also think about dog breeding. Think of all the different breeds of dogs there are. Look, from the littlest Chihuahua to big, beautiful Huskies and Malamutes to giant Great Danes and St. Bernards and everything in between. They are all Canis familiaris, one species that we as human breeders, by selecting mates, have taken to all those different morphologies. So, Darwin and Wallace witnessed what farmers and ranchers and breeders can do by changing morphology, and saw things like the Galapagos finches, where there's a wide range of morphology off of a common ground plan, and eventually they ran to this whole notion of natural selection. And natural selection has several different parts. So laying them out in steps, first of all, you need to accept that there is variation in natural populations. You look at anything, and you'll find color variation, speed variation, size variation, you name it. The second thing is that for most species in nature, not all, but most, many more organisms are born than can ever survive. So a female frog will lay hundreds, if not thousands, of eggs in a pond, but how many of those hatch to become little tadpoles? How many of those tadpoles survive to become young juvenile frogs? How many of those survive to become adult reproducing frogs themselves? Very, very few. They get eaten or destroyed by environmental extreme conditions before that happens. The second thing is that some individuals out of those thousands that could potentially thrive, have features or characters that make them better. They're faster, or they're better camouflaged, or they have more muscle twitch, slow muscle twitch fibers, or fast twitch fibers, whatever it is. Some things are just better. And those organisms then are going to have more success. And success in the biological world is defined as one thing. It is living to reproduce, produce offspring that carry on your genetic heritage. If all of those above things are true, and you also add in the idea of geologic time, that there are not just a few hundreds or thousands of years, but there are millions of years, then you can imagine tweaking these things slowly but surely over long periods of time until there is change of any kind. You know, the forced change that we do with artificial selection is relatively rapid, but in nature, there's no hurry. There's no hurry at all. And so if you look at something like giraffes, the Wallace-Darwin view of giraffes is that originally there was some population of these things, these giraffeoids, and there was variation. You had tall ones, short ones, medium-sized ones, everything. But if there was a natural selection advantage to having a longer neck, and there is in Africa, if you have a longer neck, you can reach food, leaves, and other vegetation that is higher off the ground than all of those other things you're competing with on the plains of Africa. And so there's a reason for that. Well, if that is true, then those tall-necked organisms, those individuals, will breed and they'll have more success, meaning maybe they live 7 years instead of just 5 years. Maybe they have 3 offspring a year rather than just 2. But over time, their tallness dominates the population. Now, we know today that this is due to all kinds of genetic, genomics, sexual recombination, things that are in that chapter for you to read, but I'm not specifically assigning it to you. Darwin and Wallace did not know this. They only viewed it from the perspective of the organism and understood it that way. So that as time goes by, and this arrow is time going by, and this could be hundreds of thousands to millions of years, at some point in the future, you're still going to have variation. There's always variation. But now, the average neck length might be 7.5 feet, whereas here it was 5.3 feet. So we look at populations over long periods of time. Another thing we need to talk about at this point is the whole science of taxonomy. It's a classification scheme is what we call it. It's a naming things. How do we name them? And it's not a strict view of evolution or evolutionary relatedness, but it's a crude cut at it. And so Carolus or Carl Linnaeus in the mid-1700s is the fellow that came up with this. And we use this today still. Every living thing on planet Earth is categorized as kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Kingdom is the highest grouping, and there's only 5 kingdoms. The 2 kingdoms that you most often deal with, that we're going to deal with in this class, are the kingdom Animalia, the animals, and the kingdom Plantae, the plants. And then as you go down from there, these are groupings at lower and lower levels till ultimately you reach the species. So, let's look at this. You need to memorize this. So, Kathy poured coffee on Fred's good suit. There it is. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And here's our classification. We are animals. We are in the kingdom Animalia. We are chordates. Chordates have, most of them have a spinal column, a spinal cord. There are some odd weirdos that don't, but we don't have to worry about that. The class Mammalia, you know that that's defined by having mammary glands, hair, endothermy, a bunch of other things. The order Primates, that is us and apes and monkeys. And then finally, the family Hominidae. The family Hominidae includes us and a bunch of our fossil relatives. The genus Homo, we're the only representative of the genus Homo living today, but there were ancient ones, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, etc. And there we are, Homo sapiens. And this is done for all things in the animal kingdom. So again, here we have the subphylum Vertebrata. So Vertebrata is a subphylum of the Chordata. Those are the things with spinal cords that also have vertebrae. And there's most of the animals that most of you think about. You've got reptiles like this turtle, fish, you've got amphibians like this salamander, birds like this owl, and then mammals like this wolf. If you then say the class Mammalia, notice all these earlier things, birds, amphibians, fish, turtles, they're not included, but you have everything that has hair and mammary glands and a few other characters, bony characters that we'll talk about later. Then within the class Mammalia, there is the order Carnivora, and that includes cats and dogs and bears and a few other things like weasels and skunks, etc. Then the family Canidae are all of the things that we identify as dogs or doggy-like creatures, like the fox, the coyote, the wolf. The genus Canis are those that are most like this sort of wolfy morph, the coyote and the wolf. And then finally, Canis latrans is the coyote. Canis lupus is your wolf. Canis familiaris would be your dog. And so let's just look at another example here. So in the columns, you've got specific taxa listed as their representative of each category. The rows are, there's the Linnaeus taxonomic hierarchy. So right off the bat, for these 4 taxa I'm looking at, they're all animals. Then when you get to phylum, notice 3 of them are chordata, 1 is mollusca. So these 3 that are chordates are more closely related to each other than this thing that we've identified as a mollusk. And then now let's just go down these things over here. Let's say we go down Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, Carnivora, Canidae, Canis lupus, the wolf, for this column on the extreme right side. But let's put your dog right next to it. Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, it is the same all the way down to the species designation where it's different. Let's look at this third animal, this one in the middle here. Animalia, Chordata, but instead of a mammal, it's a reptile. And then some other terms that you don't know, but then the bottom here, this is Tyrannosaurus rex. This is just to show you that this also works, and we do this for all fossil animals and plants, life as well. So this isn't something just done for living things, it's done for extinct things of the past as well. And then this fourth animal, this one second from the left over here, Animalia, mollusca, gastropoda, a whole bunch of words you don't know, but basically this is a snail. This is a very famous snail in the Caribbean. And this shows you that at some level, all life, even snails, dinosaurs, dogs, wolves, are all related at this Animalia level. And then this relationship breaks down and becomes more separated as you go down this way. So Linnaeus came up with this system of naming things just to put some order on what he saw and where to host these things in the museums, but it gives us a crude relationship of evolutionary terms. A few other things to learn. Population. Population is simply a group of interbreeding individuals, and a species then are all of the populations of those things that, if they came in contact, could interbreed with each other. Okay. What is speciation then? Speciation is if natural selection operates long enough, and if you have populations of the same species, So 2 giraffe species, or 2 robin species, or 2 rattlesnake species. But if you have a population that's in a separate place that has different natural selection pressures, maybe there's a place where giraffes weren't naturally selected for getting long necks, but running fast, more musculature in the forelimbs on the ground, you would eventually diverge to the point where you create new species. And we say that speciation or origination has occurred. Specifically, we call this an example of allopatric speciation. And this diagram of beetles shows how a barrier, what you need to do this is a barrier. So look at all the little beetles here. We've got brown ones, dark brown ones, tan ones, green ones. At some point, this is sort of geologic time going from left to right, a barrier arises. Here it's a large flowing stream like the Amazon or something, and suddenly these beetles at the north side of it can no longer interbreed or mix with the ones on the south side. Let's say these beetles don't fly, they just crawl, and a giant Amazon-sized river, that's too much for them. If the northern half has more green vegetation, more lush red or moist conditions than the southern half, the area below the river, then there could be a natural selection for color variation that favors greens north of the river where it's more moist and favors browns south of the river where there's more dry rockiness. And if that barrier is maintained long enough, separate species can arise such that even in the future, if this barrier gets removed, these are 2 separate species, and a male green individual would not know or recognize or be able to successfully mate with a female brown individual. There's lots of examples of this in the modern world, and a lot of these barriers come from plate tectonics. So here's a picture of the peninsula in South America that sort of connects North America to South America. We're looking at Panama, and look at these 2 species of these little crawfish here, Alpheus nuttingi in the Atlantic and Alpheus milsei in the Pacific. This part of the Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, has only been around for about 3.5 million years. The fossils say that at one point these 2 separate species were one single interbreeding species, but plate tectonics has forced this land barrier between them, and suddenly these southern crawfish can no longer find or interbreed with these northern ones, and there's selection for different features. Notice here they are righties in the Atlantic and lefties in the Pacific. And that is such an important thing as far as showing mates and movements, little dances for setting up the mating process, that even if you put the 2 in an aquarium, put a nuttingi male in an aquarium with a milsei female, it ain't going to happen. This shows the importance of tectonic barriers. Giant ocean basins created by what? Divergent boundaries. Mountain ranges created by convergent boundaries. Just another example from the Isthmus of Panama, these 2 fishes, an isotremus, 2 different species, they were one species back in the geologic past, but as soon as this tectonic barrier arises, natural selection has taken the northern porkfish in a different direction from the Panamic porkfish, and now they are separate species. And we find examples of this in the fossil record too. There are many, many, many ways to make species. I've just given you one, this thing called allopatric speciation. There are different speeds and rates and types. If you're a biology major, specifically an organismal biology major, you'll get into this. But for now, we're just introducing these concepts, how they work for us in geologic history. Look at these 2 pictures here. These are both trilobites. arthropod fossils, but clearly there's been different natural selection for these things. The species on the left has a thicker, more armored shell. That is its way to adapt to and evolve to protective mechanisms from predators eating them. The organism on the right side has the same issues. It has to defend itself against predators, but here natural selection has favored the growth of a covering of spines to sort of baffle or prevent predators from biting into the thing. So lots and lots of examples like this. Now, evolution and geology is a little bit different than evolution that's studied by biologists in that we observe transformations on much, much larger time scales, millions and even billions of years, and we have organisms that biologists would never know existed. If biologists didn't have fossils, if we didn't have fossils, you'd never know about dinosaurs like this iguanodon here. Well, let's look at a few other things that is documented from the geological or paleontological world that's a little bit different. So first of all, we document speciation, as do biologists, but we have actual data for it. When we first find a fossil in the rock record, we take that as the closest approximation that we can of its speciation event. And then we track it up through the rocks over the long periods of times, the millions of years that it lives, and at some point it disappears. And that is an extinction. So Tyrannosaurus rex, the dinosaur, Stegosaurus, the dinosaur. Think of any dinosaur you know. We can find the earliest fossil of it, and that is an approximation of its speciation event. Everywhere you find it, that's when it lives. And the last one, the highest one you find in the rock record, that is where the thing went extinct. We also document adaptive radiations. These are periods of time when many, many, many new species are formed for whatever reason. So we have, in this diagram right here, geologic time is at the bottom. We live in the outermost circle of this, and there's the animals that we know and love. Mammals, birds, different reptiles like crocs, snakes, lizards, different other things here, amphisbaenians, sphenodon, don't worry about them, turtles. But there is a whole world of things before that. And we can go back to particularly the Mesozoic era. And this is it's been called the Age of Reptiles because so many different reptile organisms speciate and arise then, including most of our modern sort of reptiles, and also including a lot of reptiles that have gone extinct since. We also document evolutionary trends. Again, our biologist friends, they just know these whales at the very top, mysticetes and odontocetes, toothed whales and baleen whales, but we have fossil records of these things going back to when they had limbs and lived on land. And so these names over here, Pachycetidae, Ambulocetidae, Remingtoncetidae, these are family names, and it shows sort of an evolutionary trend here, but we have many, many tens of species that document this transition from land, loss of limbs, to the water, to this major separation of whales. Evolutionary trends like the horse. Horses have been around for the past almost 60 million years, but if you were to go back 58 million years when they started, you wouldn't recognize it as a horse because it would be this little thing down at the bottom of the page, Hyracotherium, which is about the size of a small dog with a little short face, and it lived in a forest. And over time, there's this evolution to become the giant horses we know today. Now, all these weird names you see here, Hyracotherium, Orohippus, Mesohippus, Parahippus, these are genus names, so then again there's going to be more species. And what happens to horses over time is that their legs get longer and longer. They go from having 5 fingers and 5 toes to progressively 4, then 3, then 2, and now the hooves that you associate with horses, that is the giant fingernail of their middle fingers and their middle toes. Also their faces. They had short, squatty faces back when they originated, but as they needed to get bigger and process more chow, the face gets more elongated. Notice this transition from the lower half of the diagram, sort of a brownish pattern to a green pattern. That represents the evolution of grass. Prior to this, horses were forest-dwelling creatures. We can tell that because we find them among tree fossils. When we evolve grass as you know it, prairie plants as you know it, sometime here, horses move out there in a big way, and this is where they really have to get tall and big because they have to see across the plains, both to find food and avoid predators, and they get this strange tooth morphology as a result. We have lots and lots of fossil horses that document this trend, and again, biologists, we have horses. So biologists can do so much more. You know, they can look at genes, they can look at mating, they can look at all behavior, they can watch horses as they do things, but they know nothing about these ancient sort of morphologic experiments that horses went through. I said before, paleontologists also document extinctions. And again, here are two ancient whale relatives. And so besides the last species or the last individual of a species, this is important, put stars by it, we also document mass extinctions. And mass extinctions are time periods where lots of things go extinct. They are bad times, killing events. And this type diagram here, we'll talk about it more in just a minute. How you read it is, well, first of all, there's usually one axis is time. So notice the vertical axis is time in hundreds of millions of years ago. So we live on the very top of this diagram right here. There are those eras that you memorized from before, the Cenozoic, the Mesozoic, the Paleozoic. So they're in steno order with the oldest at the bottom, the youngest at the top. Now the axis on the bottom, it's not labeled here, but there's a scale. This says 125 families. So what this person has done is they have counted the number of families of fossils back through time, and about 600 million years ago, that's when we get the first things that have skeletons. And for these diagrams, as they get fatter, as they get wider, these things are called spindle diagrams. Those are time periods where we're adding things. So if that scale is true, right here at the bottom, there's probably 10 separate little families. But as you go up, there's more and more families. So there is an adaptive radiation. Where this gets fat, that is an adaptive radiation. But notice there are other periods where it pinches in. It pinches in, and here's a big pinch in between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic. Here, at the top part of the Paleozoic, the end of it, we have lots and lots of families. But boom, right there, almost instantaneously, is this drop. Here's another big one up here, and I'll say this now just to prep you for it. This drop right here between the Cenozoic and Mesozoic, this is when the asteroid hits planet Earth about 65 million years ago, and we lose all of our giant dinosaurs and so many more things. So these periods of big pinch-ins are mass extinctions. And we definitely are going to talk about those in this class some more. What else do we look at? Scales of evolution. So here's where we can tease apart what biologists do versus what geologists do. So we talk about microevolution. This is Darwin-Wallace evolution. These are these small scale changes that are mostly due to natural selection, speciation events. So biologists can do this, geologists can do this. This is this small day-to-day little changes that are driving evolution in a specific direction, like getting big giraffe necks. Macroevolution over here, these are the larger events that geologists, paleontologists study. And these are going to be a whole bunch of things like the origins, the first mammals, the first flowers, the first snakes, the first life on land, the first skeletons. And again, you see that we study it as geologists and paleontologists by fossils. Biologists can't see it. So there's micro, macro, and there's also an even bigger thing, mega evolution. Mega evolution is everything on the globe, and it is counting. Whether you're counting the number of species you have, the number of genera, the number of families over time, and when you plot that up as a function, a graph, it reveals some interesting things. So again, the bottom scale here is geologic time. Here's 0, so that's today. We live over here in this diagram. We live on the extreme left or right side. And as you go back in time, and here's 100 million, 200 million, 300 million, and then there's that geologic time scale you had to memorize, Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, and over on the y-axis, we plot number of genera. So that's in one of those Linnaean taxonomic categories. Notice that about 600 million years ago, we have nothing. We had life on planet Earth, but right about there is when we evolved skeletons. And as soon as you have a skeleton, you can have fossils, lots of good fossils. Notice this looks like a roller coaster. It has periods where it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. The original thought was that life originated some point and then boop, it's been a slow, steady climb ever since. Doing this mega evolution has revealed to us that no, life is a roller coaster. Where this is going up, where you have a positive slope, those are adaptive radiations. You are adding hundreds, thousands of genera, but then boom, you have these crises where you have the down part of the roller coaster, like this. And notice that if this were a game, if this were to run all the way to the bottom to 0, that's game over. And life has never gotten to game over, but we've come very close. The closest we've come, and this is plotting genera, is right to there. But if you plotted species, and other people have done that, this one here, at the end of the Permian, start of the Triassic, eliminates up to 96% of all species on planet Earth. So life is a series of good times, the slope goes up, and bad times when it drops. These are those mass extinction events, and notice there's 5. We call them literally the big 5, and in this class we're definitely going to take our trip through time and then try to explain these things as we go along. Again, biologists would know nothing about this. These types of things can be called mega evolutionary diagrams. The one I just showed with the roller coasters, counting things through time, the roller coasters, up, down, or the thing I showed previously, the spindle diagram, which gets fatter or wider during good times and pinches in, makes a thin waist here during bad times. So you're going to need to know both of these things.